In January 1945, with the snow of the Ardennes still soaked in blood, George Patton walked into his headquarters and said something that could have blown up the entire Allied command structure. "If you don't correct this, and if he isn't held to account, fire him, or I resign." He wasn't talking about Hitler. He wasn't talking about a German general. He was talking about Bernard Montgomery, Britain's most famous field marshal, and the man Patton was threatening was Dwight Eisenhower, the supreme commander of Allied forces in Northwest Europe. To understand why that ultimatum left Eisenhower stunned, we have to go back to the freezing twilight of late December 1944, to a moment when the world thought the Battle of the Bulge was over, and the real slaughter was only beginning. In the freezing twilight of late December 1944, a terrifying reality dawned on three men: Dwight Eisenhower, George Patton, and Bernard Montgomery. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the battle. It was the beginning of the purification. To the world, the story was simple. The 101st Airborne had held at Bastogne. Patton's Third Army had broken through, and the German advance had been stopped. But in the snow-covered Ardennes, a far deadlier trap was snapping shut. Roughly 50,000 German soldiers and hundreds of heavy tanks and assault guns were still packed into the Bulge, the elite remnants of the 5th Panzer Army. They were wounded, short of fuel, but far from harmless. If they got away, they would reappear on the Siegfried Line to be fought all over again. This is not just the story of a rescue, it's the story of the killing phase of the Bulge. The brutal, untold strategic chess game where Patton's aggression collided with Hitler's delusion, and where the fate of the Western Front hung on a single frozen corridor. Inside the headquarters of SHAF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the big wall maps told a comforting story. To the untrained eye, the red spearhead of the German advance seemed to have been cut off and blunted. But Eisenhower saw something else. Patton's breakthrough to Bastogne was a razor-thin corridor, a lifeline barely wide enough for a single supply truck to pass. German 88s on the surrounding high ground poured artillery fire into that corridor day and night. The Bulge itself was still a massive jagged wound in the Allied line, a deep pocket packed with armored divisions and SS units. As long as those forces remained, they were a dagger aimed at the heart of the Allied invasion. Eisenhower knew that if the Germans regrouped, they could still sever the line and drive toward Antwerp, turning the Ardennes into a graveyard for the liberation of Western Europe. Patton, looking at the same map with a cigar clenched between his teeth, saw something different. George Patton was not interested in simply holding the line. He wanted to amputate the German army. His philosophy was simple, brutal, and loud. "We've got them exactly where we want them. Now we can kill them." Patton demanded an immediate, simultaneous attack from both north and south, to cut the Bulge at its base, trapping the German forces in a pocket of steel and fire before they could slip back to the Siegfried Line. He paced like a caged tiger in his command post, ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the dim bunker light, screaming that every second of delay was a second the Krauts used to dig deeper. But war is never that simple. While Patton was screaming for speed, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the northern shoulder of the Bulge, was methodically stalling. Montgomery, calculating and cautious, refused to commit his forces until logistics were perfect and the weather cleared. He believed a premature attack would simply produce more dead men and burned-out tanks. This clash of personalities, Patton's fire against Montgomery's ice, created a dangerous vacuum of time. a strategic pause that German Field Marshal Walter Model desperately tried to exploit to save his army from annihilation. The friction between the American blood and guts approach and the British methodical pace became a war within the war, and the price was paid in blood and frostbite by the infantrymen shivering in the snow. Inside the German command bunker, the atmosphere was thick with the realization of impending doom. Walter Model, perhaps the Reich's best defensive tactician, knew the offensive had failed the moment Patton turned his army north. He sent urgent coded messages to Berlin, begging permission to pull his panzer divisions back behind the Rhine while they were still intact. He knew the Ardennes had turned into a meat grinder, consuming Germany's last strategic reserves. The answer from the Führer bunker was madness. Hold every yard, no retreat. Hitler, isolated and increasingly detached from reality, believed a miracle would still occur. His orders ignored the simplest facts. His soldiers were out of fuel, out of food, out of hope. The feared king tigers and panthers, monsters of engineering designed for open plains, were now clumsy giants on narrow, icy Belgian roads. Their tracks slipped on frozen mud, engines stalled in sub-zero cold. They were no longer an invasion force, they were targets. Model, commanding in the center, threw the remnants of the Führer Begleit Brigade into the fire not to win, but simply to buy time. The woods around Bastogne became a chaotic inferno of burning steel and shattered pine. The once mighty Wehrmacht was being reduced to isolated, desperate blocking groups, fighting to the death in the shadows of the Ardennes. To feel the true ferocity of this purification phase, you have to step into the frozen boots of an ordinary American infantryman from the 26th Yankee Division. Their order from 3rd Army headquarters was deceptively simple: drive north to Houffalize. Executing that meant advancing across open, snow-covered killing fields where German heavy machine guns were camouflaged under white sheets, invisible until the muzzle flashes tore through the grey mist. Every hedgerow became a fortress, every frozen stream a deadly obstacle that had to be cleared with grenades and bayonets. The air stank of cordite and blood, muted by a heavy blanket of snow. Temperatures plunged toward 0 Fahrenheit. Lubricant in M1 Garand rifles froze. The ground turned so hard that entrenching tools shattered on impact. Men stopped fighting for ideology. They fought for warmth. They stripped greatcoats from dead bodies, wrapped their feet in burlap sacks to slow frostbite, and huddled in cellars while artillery pulverized the villages above. This was the winter of iron, a war of attrition measured not in miles, but in frozen yards. Just as Patton began to build momentum in his northward push to close the trap, a new crisis erupted in the south that threatened to derail the whole strategy. On New Year's Eve 1944, in a final spasm of aggression, Heinrich Himmler launched Operation Nordwind, a secondary offensive into the Alsace region. Its purpose was simple: draw Patton's strength away from the Bulge, exploit thin American lines along the Upper Rhine, create panic in the Allied rear, and, crucially, split the alliance by threatening the city of Strasbourg, a symbol of French liberation. The German High Command hoped that by menacing Strasbourg, Eisenhower would feel forced to pull Patton's divisions away from the Ardennes, giving the trapped 5th Panzer Army room to escape. The shock rippled all the way to Paris. Eisenhower, under immense pressure and fearing a breakthrough, seriously considered ordering a retreat from Strasbourg to shorten his lines. Charles de Gaulle was furious. To him, Strasbourg was not just a military position, it was a national symbol. He threatened to pull French forces out of Allied command if the city was abandoned. The political storm was immense. The coalition itself seemed at risk just as the Bulge was beginning to crack. Eisenhower found himself trapped between military logic and political necessity, trying to hold the alliance together while Germans pounded his southern flank. Amid all this chaos, George Patton refused to blink. Patton understood that Nordwind was bait, a dangerous bait, but still a diversion. When Eisenhower asked if he needed to halt his attack in the Ardennes to shore up the South, Patton's response was characteristically defiant. He trusted the outcome of the war to the destruction of the German army in the Bulge, not to defending every inch of real estate. He kept his eyes locked on the prize at Houffalize, pushing Third Army divisions, the 35th, 91st, and 6th Armored, straight into the teeth of German defenses. He knew that if he shattered the German spine in the Bulge, Nordwind would collapse on its own. Field Marshal Montgomery, meanwhile, finally unleashed First Army from the north on January 3rd, intending to meet Patton in the middle. Just as the operation began, a blinding blizzard descended on the Ardennes. A white curtain grounded Allied aircraft and reduced visibility to near zero. The weather neutralized the Allied advantage in air power and artillery spotting. The battle reverted to primitive basics: infantry, tanks, and close-quarters fighting. The white hell had returned, and it favored the defender. Montgomery's advance was slow and painful. Tanks struggled up icy hills. Infantry were pinned by German strongpoints that only revealed themselves at point-blank range. The fighting in early January 1945 was some of the most miserable of the entire war. Men wading through waist-deep snow, weapons jamming in the cold, fingers turning black from frostbite and gangrene. American tanks slid uncontrollably on ice and were ambushed by German panzer teams hidden in snowdrifts. Every village, farmhouse, and crossroads had to be turned into rubble before the advance could continue. The terrifying shriek of the Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, the screaming Mimis, echoed through the valleys, breaking the nerves of even seasoned veterans. Patton, reading the reports, fumed at the slowness of the northern advance. He believed Montgomery's caution was allowing the Germans to conduct an orderly fighting withdrawal instead of being encircled and destroyed. Every hour the trap remained open was an hour in which German tanks and guns slipped away to the east. Yet despite the friction at the top, the sheer weight of Allied pressure began to crush the German pocket, compressing retreating units into an ever-shrinking kill box. By January 9th, the gap between Patton's forces in the south and First Army in the north had narrowed to just a few miles. Those last miles were defended by the desperate remnants of SS Panzer divisions, men who believed they could not surrender and fought with the ferocity of trapped animals. The battle had turned from a defensive emergency into a hunt. As the calendar turned to the second week of January, the Battle of the Bulge shifted from desperate Allied defense to methodical industrial slaughter. We often focus on the American advance. To grasp the scale of the victory, you have to look at the German retreat. The roads leading east out of the pocket, especially the winding routes towards St. Vith and the German border, became corridors of absolute destruction. American artillery spotters in fragile Piper Cubs circling above the trees looked down on a traffic jam of apocalyptic proportions. The pride of the Wehrmacht, remnants of the 2nd Panzer, Panzer Lehr, and SS formations, were squeezed onto single-lane roads hemmed in by dense forests and ravines. They were no longer an army. They were a target. Sensing the enemy was trying to limp away with their last heavy equipment, Patton ordered his artillery commanders to unleash time-on-target barrages. This technique synchronized dozens of guns so that every shell, regardless of distance, arrived on the target at the same moment. No warning whistles. No time to dive for cover. One moment, the traffic crept forward through frozen silence. The next, the entire world became a synchronized wall of blast and steel. The roads clogged with burning half-tracks, overturned Kubelwagens, shattered Panthers, and even dead horses still being used to pull guns because Germany had run out of fuel. Under the grey Belgian sky, the retreat turned into a mechanical graveyard stretching for miles. Inside German command vehicles, radio chatter became a chorus of panic. Officers who had conquered France in 1940 and swept into Russia in 1941 were now begging for permission to abandon their vehicles and flee on foot. General Hasso von Manteuffel, respected by both sides for tactical brilliance, saw his army's discipline cracking. Hardened veterans threw away their rifles and trudged east with blank stares, broken less by enemy infantry than by ceaseless American firepower and the killing cold. The Bulge was no longer a bold maneuver. It was a cage being slowly crushed by a giant's hand. While soldiers bled in the snow, a different war was erupting in Allied high command. On January 7th, tension between Montgomery and the American generals reached boiling point. Montgomery had been given temporary command of the American 1st and 9th Armies in the north during the worst of the German offensive. Now, with the crisis easing, he held a press conference that would become a masterclass in unintentional insult. In a small schoolhouse, standing ramrod straight before the press, Montgomery described the battle as if he were a headmaster tidying up a messy classroom. He implied that the American line had been on the verge of collapse until he, the British Field Marshal, stepped in to sort it out. He barely mentioned Patton's dramatic drive from the south or the stand of the 101st at Bastogne. When news reached Omar Bradley's headquarters, the usually calm American general went silent with a cold, vibrating rage. Patton exploded. He told his staff that if Eisenhower did not correct the record and check Montgomery's behavior, he would resign his commission rather than serve under a man who claimed credit for American blood. This is the moment behind your title. Fire him, or I resign. Patton's ultimatum was not delivered directly to Montgomery. It was directed at Eisenhower, the man trying to hold the entire alliance together. And that's why it shook Ike. He was already furious with Montgomery. Now one of his most important American field commanders was threatening to walk out. Eisenhower found himself in the center of a political hurricane. He knew Montgomery was a technically brilliant defensive commander, but he also knew Monty's arrogance was becoming a strategic liability that could fracture the alliance. Eisenhower prepared a message to London that was, in effect, his own ultimatum. Either Montgomery stops undermining my commanders, or the combined chiefs of staff can find a new supreme commander. At the same time, Patton was telling his inner circle he'd rather resign than serve under Montgomery's shadow. If Eisenhower fired Montgomery, he risked a political explosion in Britain and headlines at home. If he did nothing, he risked losing Patton and the trust of American commanders. This was the closest the Western Allies came to a real command breakdown during the entire war. Winston Churchill understood the danger immediately. Britain owed its survival to American industrial and military power. If American generals felt humiliated and sidelined, the alliance could crack just as victory was in sight. Churchill personally intervened. He delivered a speech to the House of Commons that went out of its way to praise the American armies as the primary victors of the Ardennes. Publicly, he put Montgomery in his place without naming him, and gave Eisenhower the political cover he needed to calm Patton and Bradley down without detonating the alliance. The coalition held, but the personal trust between Patton and Montgomery was buried under Belgian snow. Eisenhower had seen just how close pride and public statements had come to undoing everything. That is why Patton's "fire him or I resign" threat left him stunned. Ike knew he couldn't simply fire Monty, not yet, and he also knew he couldn't afford to lose Patton. While the generals fought a political war, nothing changed for the men crawling forward in the snow. For the 11th Armored Division pushing up from the south, the war had taken on a darker, more personal edge. Around Malmedy, they uncovered frozen evidence of German atrocity, the bodies of 84 American POWs gunned down in the snow by SS troops under Joachim Peiper. Hands bound with wire, faces preserved in ice, a cold fury settled over the army. The war stopped being about lines on a map. It became about vengeance. American units, normally disciplined about taking prisoners, began showing no mercy to SS troops. German soldiers knew they could expect no quarter. Encounters in dark woods became fights to the death. Around Foy and Neuville, the 101st Airborne, now supported by Patton's armor, went on the offensive to clear the high ground. They weren't just advancing, they were purging the forest of an enemy they now saw as monstrous. Major Richard Winters and Easy Company watched novice American tankers charge blindly into hidden anti-tank guns and die in streaks of fire. It was a brutal lesson in the cost of aggression. Patton, reading casualty reports, saw his Third Army losing as many men to exposure as to the enemy. Trench foot became epidemic. Feet turned black inside wet boots. Medical tents overflowed with men whose bodies had simply quit in the cold. Yet Patton refused to halt. He drove his jeep to the front, standing in the snow, screaming at convoys to keep moving, dragging his army forward yard by agonizing yard. Any pause in his mind was a gift to the enemy. The geographic goal of the entire counteroffensive was the small town of Houffalize. Sitting in a deep valley along the Orthe River, Houffalize was the designated meeting point where Patton's Third Army from the south and Hodges' First Army from the north would finally link up and close the trap on remaining German forces. By January 15th, Houffalize was reduced to rubble by relentless bombing. The Germans had turned every cellar into a machine gun nest, knowing that losing Houffalize would split the Bulge in half and leave thousands of comrades trapped to the west. On the morning of January 16, 1945, a patrol from Patton's 11th Armored Division moved cautiously down a winding road into town, eyes scanning ruins for the silhouette of a panzer. At the same moment, a reconnaissance unit from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, approached from the north. For a brief, tense moment, they almost fired on each other. Turrets traversed, fingers hovered on triggers. Then someone recognized the silhouettes. A green flare arced into the leaden sky. Engines dropped from combat, raw to idle. They had done it. There were no speeches, no brass bands, just filthy, exhausted men shaking hands in a ruined street, sharing cigarettes with trembling fingers, staring at each other with hollow eyes. They stood on rubble where a town had been, surrounded by the stench of death, cordite, and frozen mud. But that handshake mattered. The Bulge was officially cut. The German gamble was broken. Hitler's last great offensive in the West had failed catastrophically. With the link-up complete, German forces that hadn't escaped east were trapped in isolated pockets, cut off from fuel, ammo, and hope. The mopping up that followed was less dramatic, but still deadly, as German rearguards fought for every road and bridge to get something, anything, back to the Siegfried Line. Patton immediately turned his eyes east, toward the dragon's teeth of the German frontier. To him, the Ardennes had been a detour on the way to Berlin. But as the blizzards lifted, the cost of the Bulge became clear. Over 75,000 American casualties, the bloodiest battle in US Army history. Nearly 100,000 German casualties, most of Germany's remaining tanks and aircraft destroyed. The Luftwaffe's last gasp on New Year's Day had effectively burned out its strength. When the snow melted, Belgian civilians uncovered bodies that had been buried in drifts for weeks. It took years to clear the fields. Patton wrote in his diary with pride and somberness. He had pulled off his greatest maneuver, wheeling an entire army 90 degrees in midwinter to strike a decisive blow. He had helped save Bastogne, crushed the last German offensive in the west, and restored the Allied front. But he knew the war was not over. The beast was mortally wounded, but it would fight harder on its own soil. The Battle of the Bulge was the fire that forged final victory, proving that Allied armies could withstand the very worst Germany could throw at them and still advance. The road to the heart of the Reich was now open, and George Patton intended to be the first to cross the finish line. Now put yourself in Eisenhower's shoes during that January 1945 command crisis. You've just survived the Bulge. Your alliance has held, barely. You're furious at Montgomery's arrogance, and now Patton is effectively saying, "Fire him, or I resign." What do? Do you risk shattering the coalition by sacking Britain's most famous general? Or do you swallow the insult to your American commanders to keep the alliance intact? Let me know your verdict in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the battles, personalities, and near misses that shaped the Second World War, subscribe to Last Stand History and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next episode.